Hello, in this talk I'm going to be looking at the Anatolian Seljuks, looking in particular at their situation on the eve of the First Crusade. Now, the background to the history of the Anatolian Seljuks is the much broader series of population movements and invasions that was the formation of the Seljuk sultanate, which spanned much of Persia and what today would be Iraq, Syria and other neighbouring regions, the establishment of this vast empire. Now, amidst the creation of this empire, various Turkmen groups, and by Turkmen I mean Turks who maintain a nomadic way of life, began to raid into the Caucasus and also into Anatolia, and by Anatolia that would be roughly modern day Turkey. And those Turkmen groups begin to raid into Anatolia, which at this point is the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire, looking for plunder, but also for grazing for their various herds and flocks. And so the raids begin in about the late 1020s, but they really begin to gather pace in the 1040s when these various Turkmen groups try and start tackling cities or towns or other larger areas in Anatolia. They meet a fair amount of resistance, at least initially, but then at the Battle of Manzikert, these Turkmen groups, led by the Seljuk Sultan called Alp Arslan, win a major victory over the Byzantine army. Now, the battle itself is significant, but what's most significant about it is the outbreak of civil war in the Byzantine Empire directly after the battle. During the battle itself, the Byzantine Emperor Romanus IV Diogenes was taken captive by the Sultan Alp Arslan, and it's his captivity that rather triggers this civil war, creating an opportunity for these Turkmen tribes to spread their influence even further in Anatolia, with some Turkmen groups actually taking employment with various Byzantine factions in their ongoing civil war. So this is the background to the formation of the Anatolian Seljuk dynasty. Now, within the emergence of the broader Seljuk Sultanate across much of the Near East, there were various factions within the Seljuk family trying to maintain control over the Sultanate itself and the title of Sultan. And among the various contenders trying to secure leadership over the emerging Seljuk Sultanate was a warrior called Kutlumus. Now, he wasn't successful in his ambitions, but he had several sons who would be very important, and one of them, called Suleiman, he began to acquire a reputation for himself in Anatolia, and he began to acquire leadership over various Turkmen groups across Anatolia. Not all Turkmen groups, there were various other important leaders in the area as well, but Suleiman became a leading figure not only in the various incursions launched by the Turkmen, but also in the relations with the Byzantine Empire and the Byzantine Empire's efforts to try and secure Turkmen auxiliaries. Now, over time, Suleiman's territories grew. He conquered Antioch in the year 1084, a crucial city in southern Anatolia, northern Syria. But perhaps more importantly, 3 years before that, in 1081, he also acquired control over the city of Nicaea. Now, Nicaea is not far from Constantinople, and so by this stage you can see just how far the Turkmen's influence has spread across Anatolia by this stage. Now, Suleiman himself was killed in 1086, and he was then succeeded by his son Kilij Arslan. And here we're looking very much at the origins of what would become the Anatolian Seljuk sultanate. Now, you'll notice that the title Seljuk was claimed by these rulers, and that's important because they were very much seen as a rival dynasty by the broader Seljuk sultanate in the Near East. And so rather than the Anatolian Seljuks being just one region within the broader Seljuk sultanate, they are seen very much as being a rival dynasty and a threat to the Seljuk Sultanate centred in what would be Western Persia. And that will shape much of their history. There's a great deal of fighting, there's a great deal of political manoeuvring between the Anatolian Seljuks, in some cases looking for opportunities to take power in the south as well, and the Seljuks in the south looking for ways to either curb the influence or carry out their rivalries against the Anatolian Seljuks in the north. But it's Kilij Aslan and his territories that would be the main area crossed by the armies of the First Crusade in Anatolia. Having said that, there were various other Turkish dynasties that had a great deal of power in Anatolia as well, and the other really powerful dynasty was called the Danishmendids, which had enormous influence a little bit to the east of the Anatolian Seljuks. So this is the situation on the eve of the Crusades. Now, one of the key questions associated with the formation of the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate, and indeed the other Turkish powers of Anatolia, is how this changed or disrupted the various communities who had been there before they arrived. On one hand, should we see this as an enormously destructive and disruptive series of invasions? Or on the other end of the scale, should we see this as being a series of invasions where actually the Turkmen accommodated themselves very quickly to the local communities whose way of life, after a brief period of disturbance, was able to carry on largely undisrupted? Well, there's a number of different factors here. We hear various reports from this era speaking of attacks and massacres and burning cities, all of which speak of considerable disruption. Although there are also other areas in Anatolia which seem to have been far more lightly touched by the fighting and far less impacted by the incursions of the various Turkmen tribes. So perhaps it's a mixed picture. It's difficult to build an overall image when there seems to be a great deal of variation across different regions. I think a particularly important consideration here is the fact that Anatolia at this time, and in many areas, was a war zone, with various armies, whether that's Turkmen groups, Seljuk armies, Norman mercenaries, Byzantine armies, crisscrossing the region, fighting their various campaigns, trying to gather enough food to feed their armies as they pass, raiding to acquire plunder. And so you can imagine that there must have been a great deal of disruption, not so much because they were intentionally targeting, or any army was intentionally targeting local communities, but just in the passage of those armies and the warcraft of that era. But it has to be said, this is an ongoing source of discussion. Various different historians have put forward different views on the effects of the Turkmen incursions and the broader wars of this era. So this question remains very much up in the air, and there's various schools of thought on it. Now, one of the really big problems we face when trying to understand the emergence and establishment of the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate is the sheer lack of sources available. There are some Byzantine sources, although of course they have their own perspective. There are various records in Western Christendom's sources, but they have their own perspective, naturally enough. We have various Islamic authors, but not necessarily from Anatolia, and they have their own perspective, and many other authors writing in later centuries when the situation has changed, who again have their own perspectives too. But we have very little, in fact virtually nothing, from the Anatolian Seljuks themselves. And so this creates the problem of trying to understand their history without actually hearing what their view would be, what's their narrative of the events of this era, and how would they present what they're doing and why they're doing it. So this is only a very brief introduction to the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate. Please do look at the other videos in this collection.